Okay, so this is the next lesson in geometry. It's called paragraph proofs. Okay, paragraph proofs. So a few sentences to start, okay? This first sentence says, undefined terms, definitions, postulates, and algebraic properties of equality are used to prove that other statements or conjectures are true. Once a statement or conjecture has been shown to be true, it is called a theorem. A theorem. And it can be used like a definition or postulate to justify other statements are true. Okay, so something that's been proven to be true is called a theorem. Okay, some of this is review from earlier in the unit, but this next definition is called a proof, which we already talked about algebraic proofs. But a proof again is a logical argument in which each statement you make is supported by a statement that is accepted as true. Okay. And one type of proof that we're going to do today is called a paragraph proof. My least favorite one, but paragraph proof. In this type of proof, you're going to write a paragraph to explain why a conjecture for a given situation is true. Okay. So here are some key concepts for essential parts of a good proof. State the theorem or conjecture to be proven. List the given information. If possible, draw a diagram. Sometimes the diagram will be drawn for you. If not, you should always try to draw a diagram. State what is to be proved, and then develop a system of deductive reasoning. Okay, so I have 3 examples today of paragraph proofs. This first one. Given that M is the midpoint of segment PQ, write a paragraph proof to show that segment PM is congruent to segment MQ. Okay. So again, we want to prove that PM is congruent to MQ. We want to prove what's called the midpoint theorem. And I don't just want to start with that. I want to prove why it's true. I want to prove that. So here's how I'm going to start the proof. Okay. Okay, so we know M is the midpoint of PQ. So I'm going to say, from the definition of midpoint of a segment, you can say that PM equals MQ. Then I want to prove the midpoint theorem. I don't just want to stop by saying that. I want to prove that. So I'm trying to prove it using other information. Okay, by the definition of midpoint, if M is the midpoint of PQ, then PM equals MQ. Okay, so this means that PM and MQ have the same measure because they're equal. So this means that PM and MQ have the same measure. Since they're equal, it means they have the same measure. Since they have the same measure, it means that they are congruent, okay? So I'm going to say, therefore, PM and MQ are congruent. Segment PM and MQ are congruent. Okay? If 2 segments have the same measure, then they are congruent. So let me just finish off by saying, I'll say, thus, PM is congruent to MQ by, and I'll say, the definition of congruence. Okay, so again, we were given that M is the midpoint of PQ. So we were given M as the midpoint. So we can use the definition of midpoint to say that PM equals MQ. Okay, So since I said PM equals MQ, it means that they have the same measure. Since they have the same measure, I said they are congruent. And so I said, thus, PM, segment PM, is congruent to segment MQ by the definition of congruence. Okay, so I proved the midpoint theorem. Okay, so on the next page, this is the midpoint theorem. Okay, so going forward, you can just say two segments are congruent by the midpoint theorem. Okay, if M is the midpoint of AB, then AM is congruent to MB. I did not want to just say that in example 1. I did not just want to say the midpoint theorem and get it in one step. I wanted to prove the midpoint theorem using other information right here. Okay, but going forward, now we can use the midpoint theorem. It's right here. Okay, so let's use that for example 2. Example 2. In the figure below, point B is the midpoint of AC, and point C is midpoint of BD. Write a paragraph proof to show that AB equals CD. So here's what I'm going to say first. Let's see. I'm going to say, okay, since B is the midpoint of AC, since B is the midpoint of AC, AB, segment AB, is congruent to segment BC by the midpoint theorem. Now I can specify the midpoint theorem because I just gave that to you. AB is congruent to BC by the midpoint theorem. Okay. And we have point C is the midpoint of BD. So I'm going to say since C is the midpoint of segment BD, I can say that BC is congruent to CD. BC is congruent to CD. Again, that's by the midpoint theorem above. Okay. So since I have AB is congruent to BC and BC is congruent to CD, I can now say that AB is congruent to CD. So I'm going to say it follows that segment AB is congruent to segment CD by the transitive property of congruence. Okay, that's important. Okay, so by the transitive property. Earlier, we did transitive property of equality, but since these are congruent symbols in their segments, I'm going to say transitive property of congruence. Okay? And now, since I know that the two segments are congruent, I can say that they are equal. So I'm going to say, thus, AB equals CD, okay, because I know they're congruent, so I can say they're equal. I'll say by the definition of congruent segments. Okay. Okay, last one that we're going to do right now, example 3, says, in the figure below, the measure of angle A equals 25 degrees, and the measure of angle C equals 110 degrees. Write a paragraph proof to prove that the measure of angle 40, that's a typo. It should say prove that the measure of angle B equals 45 degrees. So I'm going to change that on Classroom. But it should say to prove that the measure of angle B equals 45 degrees. Okay, I'll change that online in a minute on Classroom, but it should say to prove that the measure of angle B equals 45 degrees. Okay. So here we go. Let's see, how should we start this one off? I'll say we are given, you don't have to stop by doing something. Say we are given the measure of angle A equals 25 degrees and the measure of angle C equals 110 degrees. You can start with the givens. You don't always have to do that for these types of proofs, but I'm going to write that first. Okay. Then let's say that we know that the measure of angle A plus the measure of angle B plus the measure of angle C equals. Do you know what that equals? It equals 180 degrees. Okay? Because all the angles in the triangle always add up to equal 180 degrees. Okay? That does have a name, so I'll introduce that now. It's called the triangle. Because the triangle, angle, because we're talking about angles, sum, we're adding them together, theorem. Okay, so the triangle angle sum theorem says that all the angles in the triangle add up to equal 180 degrees. I think most of you know that already. You might not know the name of it, but that's what it's called. It's called the triangle angle sum theorem. Okay. I'm going to say by substitution, or maybe I should say by the substitution property to sound better. By the substitution property, we know that the measure of angle A equals 25 degrees. So I'm going to say we know that 25 plus the measure of angle B, because we don't know that, plus the measure of angle C we know is 110. So I'll say plus 110 equals 180. I'm going to say, so now we're going to simplify. So I'll say after simplifying, we have the measure of angle B plus 135 equals 180. So again, that's combining like terms. I did 25 plus 110 to get 135. And now, I'll say thus, the measure of angle B equals 45 degrees, which is what we were supposed to prove. And what I did there is I used subtraction. By the subtraction property of equality. Okay, so again, we're not going to do too many paragraph proofs, but those are 3 examples of paragraph proofs. You're given some information, you have to prove some other information, and you write a paragraph to do so. Okay, just make sure your sentences sound good. And that's the end of that lesson. That lesson was called Paragraph Proofs.